Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Turner. Now, another witness?
Indeed, my lord. The first witness this afternoon, my lord, is Mrs. Sarah Jane Laing from the Scottish Land and Estates.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Laing.
Good afternoon.
Right, Mr. Turner will have some questions for you.
Thank you, my lord.
Thank you, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Laing. Before I begin, could I just remind you that this afternoon's hearing will be transcribed. There is a stenographer who will be frantically trying to take notes. They do ask if we could try and speak slowly and clearly. It will make it easier for the transcript to be produced. Could I ask you first of all to state your full name?
It's Sarah Jane Laing.
Thank you. And you're here representing Scottish Land and Estates, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And Scottish Land and Estates have provided a written response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct.
And my lord, for the record, that is reference number SCI SL AE XX number 2.
Yep.
Could you tell his lordship, Mrs. Laing, what is your current position with Scottish Lands and Estates?
I'm currently the Chief Executive.
Thank you. And how long have you been in that role?
I've been in that role for just over 5 years.
And how long have you been with Scottish Lands and Estates?
For 20 years.
And before you were Chief Executive, which roles did you hold?
I was Director of Policy and Parliamentary Affairs, Head of Policy and Policy Advisor.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you some questions now about who or what Scottish Lands and Estates are. Could you tell us what kind of organisations Scottish Lands and Estates are, and in particular who its members are?
So Scottish Land and Estates, or SLE, is a membership organisation. We are a not-for-profit company limited by guarantee. Our membership is a very diverse membership, but the one thing that binds them together is their link to rural land. So the vast majority of our members are those who manage land and businesses linked to rural land in Scotland. What they do is they farm, they are foresters, they manage country estates, they are involved in the production of renewable energy, they're food producers, they're very, very diverse, and I think this is one of the things that challenged us as an organisation during the pandemic, and also challenged the government. We have members who are food producers. As I said, we've got members who are retail, in all aspects of tourism. It did feel at some times that whatever the activity that was happening, our members were involved in it. Our members also involve the professional firms who advise those involved in rural businesses, so accountants, land managements and lawyers, and also the trades and suppliers, so all those providing catering, vehicle maintenance, fencing materials, all those aspects that of things that happen on a daily basis on farms and estates across Scotland.
Thank you. And could you tell us how the organisation is funded?
Primarily through membership subscriptions, so I would say that about 90% of our income comes from membership subscriptions or membership contributions. We also receive a small amount of money from time to time for carrying out specific project work, and we also receive some income from affinity schemes such as those with vehicle and energy suppliers, and we do provide some services for other organisations such as Historic Houses Scotland, but primarily through membership fees.
Thank you. And are you able to tell his lordship what the aim or the purpose of SLE is?
So I suppose the mission and vision of Scottish Land and Estates is to secure a vibrant rural Scotland, delivering benefits for all. We're here to provide support to businesses to make sure that they are able to grow and to deliver benefits for people, jobs and nature. And hopefully we're also there to represent their views to politicians and other decision makers to make sure that we have a supportive climate for rural businesses to be able to operate within.
Thank you. And I suppose in ordinary times, we'll obviously come on to talk about the pandemic, but just in ordinary times prior to the pandemic or even after the pandemic, how do you promote that vision? What do you do to achieve the aims of the organisation?
So we do it through a number of ways. We are an organisation that likes to celebrate rural success. We like to inspire people. So we share stories of the fantastic things that are happening in rural Scotland, primarily through media work, social media, and through various award schemes. We are regular contributors to rural magazines, all the routes to audience that we can. We work with politicians. We are on numerous stakeholder groups in the Scottish Government and with agencies, working across all areas to try to make sure that we're delivering homes, we're delivering jobs, we're delivering for nature in Scotland. So we're a very visible organisation for the size of us. I would say that we're involved in probably a disproportionate amount of areas with Scottish Government and its agencies. And we also provide direct support, so direct support to businesses. We're not just an organisation that's there to do this sort of macro level work in terms of representation. We carry out events which provide one-to-many training and advice for our members, whether it's webinars or through conferences and training events. And we also provide one-to-one support for our members. So we have a team of policy experts that members can call on to provide advice on housing, owner's liability, legal issues, access issues, a wide range of challenges that they face. And the final thing that we do is we are a promoter of good practice. So again, we have accreditation schemes to recognise and acknowledge good practice, and we undertake significant activity in that area to try and improve the quality of land management and rural business activity in all sectors.
Thank you. You mentioned obviously the diversity of your members' interests in business. You've mentioned, I think, in passing also the fact that it didn't necessarily fall into sort of any particular sector, obviously very many different sectors. You also pick up a point in your Rule 8 response about a lack of understanding of the realities of rural land management, I think you put it, from government. Are these issues in terms of diversity and the lack of understanding, are these matters which SLE try to address with government, I should say?
We absolutely do. So we undertake quite a lot of activity to try and raise awareness in this area. So we do CPD with a number of the Scottish Government's agencies to bring people out onto estates and farms so they can understand the practicalities of rural land management. We also, where we can, provide information on case studies for MSPs and others, so that as well as looking at things from a policy perspective, they can understand what individual land managers or groups of land managers are facing. And I think this is something that we increased at the start of the pandemic. We tried to make sure that people were not thinking about land management just as an abstract term, but they were understanding about the examples. Bringing things to life was something that was really important to Scottish Land and Estates. It's something that we did pre-pandemic, continue to do, but we did think it was a very particularly important part of the work that we did, certainly at the early stages.
Thank you. You talk about bringing things to life, and I suppose to bring things to life for His Lordship, you've talked about the diversity of the interests. I suppose, for the benefit of His Lordship, I wonder if you could explain to us how that actually exists in reality. Are we talking about disparate individuals, or are we talking about large estates doing many things? Can you explain how that actually looks on the ground?
So in our membership, it's both. So we have members of various sizes, various motivations. So you know, within our membership, we'll have wholly arable farmers in Fife and in the East Coast, where they are, they're small, but they're very, very focused on food production. But they could be next door to a diversified estate, and that estate would be involved in a small amount of farming, but would also have tourism. It would be a renewable energy generator. It probably would also be involved in providing business space, and it would also be a private landlord. So side by side, both of those would be SLE members. We also have, in other areas of Scotland, you would have some people who are involved in crofting landlords, so again supporting small micro businesses, and next door to them could be a commercial forestry owner. We have members who are full-time resident on their businesses, on their land in Scotland, and others who are full-time residents in other parts of the UK, and also many members who are full-time are residents abroad, but would see Scotland as their second home, or as part of their larger land holdings. So the diversity is both in terms of the members, but also the diversity in terms of estates. And in terms of some of those examples, some of those that may be more well known to people, if you take somewhere like Hateley Estate in Highland Perthshire, Hateley Estates is involved in everything from a caravan site to deer stalking, to wildlife tourism photography, to the heritage of the castle itself, as well as a number of micro businesses which operate from that estate. So in one business you had a multitude of different operations and different strands. And as I say, next door you could have had 2 or 3 smaller SLE members. One would be a forester, the next one would be a farmer, and the third one would maybe see themselves as purely as a gin distiller. All of those would be within the Scottish Land and Estates membership.
Thank you. You've mentioned there that one of the ways that you, part of your education, I suppose, of politicians and others is to look at examples, and I would like to do that for the benefit of his lordship. I'd like to look at some examples now, and in particular consider the particular consequences that the pandemic had in respect of these examples. If I could start by looking at the types of business, one of the types of business that you discussed a moment ago, the members that you referred to as having diversified interests or diversified activities. Were there any particular considerations that affected them during the pandemic?
I think the main issue was that they didn't fit neatly into one box. So in terms of either advice or funding that was coming from the Scottish Government, they tended to be very sectorally specific, and you had to meet certain criteria to trigger that. That's fine if you have a business where they have one or maybe one main area of activity. A large number of my members did not fit neatly within that scheme, so we had a number of members who didn't quite trigger that 50% requirement to access certain funds. And we had others where they met the requirements from an HMRC point of view to qualify as a self-catering business, but suddenly didn't qualify as a self-catering business from the support from a certain local authority, because that was only part of their business rather than a major part of their business. And when you looked at that, it did feel that many of the members who were affected in every single aspect, whether that was tourism, food supply, housing, suddenly they couldn't access any of the pots because they didn't have quite enough to fit into one of these boxes. And from a guidance point of view, what we were finding is, again, everything was very, focused on siloed activity. And what we weren't seeing is how did the interplay between different areas of a diversified land-based business come together. So there was guidance for agricultural workers, but you had gamekeepers and forestry workers who to us were very similar, but they were seen by the Scottish Government as entirely different. So you had a number of employers who were trying to grapple with this problem of having three to them quite similar groups of employees having to be treated entirely differently. So some would qualify as key workers, some wouldn't. Some were working in enterprises that could access funding, some weren't. And it really was quite challenging for them to have that kind of holistic view of their estate. And I think the other one is that we often have a number of these diversified businesses where people will work part-time in different part of the enterprises. So again, from a furlough point of view, and from other areas, it was difficult for some to understand how that could be applied when you might only need them as a key worker at certain times of the year, or you might only need them as a key worker for 2 or 3 days of a week. So it was very, very challenging, I would say, from funding, guidance, employer, and as an organisation trying to tailor sometimes quite generic advice to really quite specific examples was where we had to focus the bulk of our activity.
Thank you. And in respect of those issues, are those matters that you feel were, again, it's maybe implicit from the fact that you're saying they didn't really fall in any particular category, but were those matters that you felt were being addressed by government in terms of their approach to guidance or support or anything? No,
it was very frustrating because we didn't feel that they were. There were times when you were having conversations where you did feel it had been understood, or certainly was supported at a cabinet level, that ministers understood. And then when the support and guidance was issued, that seemed to have I suppose disappeared. So we had a number of occasions, I think, in terms of some country sports tourism, which to us is is just normal tourism in Scotland. But I think a number of civil servants really struggled to understand where that sat. So we were seeing support for country for tourism per se, but not for country sports tourism. We're seeing guidance for certain self-catering, but not self-catering linked to country sports tourism. So, as I say, there seemed to be, Mr Ewing was very, very supportive, Fergus Ewing, at the CAB Sec at the time, of making sure that our voices were heard, we were part of the discussions. But it did seem that as you moved away from Cabinet Secretary to the development of the guidance and funding, that some of the nuances and the specific needs of certain sectors, such as country sports tourism, were lost.
You've mentioned it, so I'll come on to now, if you don't mind, talking about country sport tourism. You've mentioned there that it seemed to get lost, notwithstanding that you'd mentioned it. In the arrangements that were being met, again, it's implicit, I think, from what you're saying, that it didn't fall under any of the more general schemes that were being produced. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And do you feel that was there a reason for that?
I think there's different reasons for that at different times. I think it's a sector that's not always supported across government. I think at other times, I think it was a lack of awareness of the scale of the issue that was affecting the sector. So I think there was a failure to understand I suppose the time that's required in terms of country sports. Whether that's fishing, deer stalking, or some of the shooting, you can't just switch it on and turn it off. So I think there was sometimes we're having discussions on tourism where they were purely thinking in terms of people arriving. You can close your accommodation or you can close your tourism business, but failing to understand to have any kind of future business when it comes to fishing and shooting. You have to carry on some degree of activity. There's things that go on with that. When it came to guidance, we asked for guidance for the sector repeatedly, and in the end, Mr Ewing asked the sector to provide to draft the guidance for approval by Scottish Government, and I think we ended up with a really good product. But that was because of the sector being proactive itself and suggesting this is the way in which we can operate safely, and these are steps that we can take to ensure that the minimum of activity can be undertaken to ensure the future of country sports tourism in Scotland, and at the same time make sure we're complying with the COVID regulations.
Thank you. We've heard today about a number of schemes which were supporting tourism as a more general topic. Was country sport tourism not captured by that?
No, so sporting enterprises or those paying sporting rates, so those are the sporting businesses, the sporting tourism businesses, didn't qualify for the 100% relief that was available for retail, hospitality and leisure. So all they were able to achieve, to access at that time, was the universal 1.6 relief, which was the freezing of the poundage rate. So they were left out of that box. They were then able to apply to the Creative Tourism and Hospitality Enterprise Hardship Fund, which was it felt like a sort of more competitive fund, and some of them were able to apply for the Hardship Fund and the Job Retention Scheme, but they weren't able to get that automatic 100% rates relief, which would have been very, very welcome by the sector.
Was there a reason why they weren't able to do that? I mean, on its face, as you've described, it seems that a lot of the activities are similar. Was there a reason given, or rather, was it a disqualification or a lack of qualification, if I can put it that way?
If there was, we never received one. Certainly we wrote to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance at the time, arguing our case that they qualified as hospitality and leisure businesses, but the answer was that the answer that we received at the time was just that here's some other routes to support, that these businesses don't meet the criteria. But there's no real definition or reason given as to why that was.
Thank you. You've talked about the activities and the fact that, particularly in relation to sporting tourism, activities go on throughout the year. Were there other activities that go on throughout the year in respect of diversified estates and the like?
So I suppose even if it's not sporting, the wildlife management aspect, so certainly when it comes to deer management, because deer sadly are herbivores, which means that they impact on crops, they impact on other things. So if you stop your deer management, then what then happens is a whole load of issues in terms of food production. So deer management was something that we felt should continue, and it was something that we spoke to the Scottish Government about on a number of occasions. And some areas, some local authorities seemed to indicate that they were quite happy for deer management to fall under the key worker definition. Others not so much. I think some of the other areas were in relation to sort of visitor management, health and safety, because landowners have, there are liability aspects of being a landowner. So when we saw an increase of visitors to rural Scotland, it meant that there was an increased risk of issues arising. So we saw things such as making sure that paths were safe, looking at things like car parking, and also sadly dealing with issues of antisocial behaviour, dirty camping and fly tipping. So all of those were land management activities that have always happened, but suddenly were having to happen on a much, much larger scale and being undertaken by many more people in Scotland. And
I mean, these kinds of maintenance issues, were the estates able to continue those?
In some, again, at the start it was really unclear. So we were seeing conflicting advice being given to us, and certainly I would say in the first month or so of lockdown, things did stop. Because everyone at that point was unsure as to what qualified. People who were involved in the food supply chain, that was clear under the terms of the legislation. But it was the wider aspects of the land management linked to that. I would say that certainly there was a lull at the start as we waited for clarity. And probably because of that lack of clarity, we then started playing catch-up on a few issues just post-lockdown, when people started to kind of move around. And at that point, people had been furloughed, activities had been stopped, so we didn't have in place the structure to deal with the rise in visitor managers. We certainly didn't have the structures in place to deal with the consequences of the closure of recycling centres, which unfortunately just became dumping on private land in many cases. So I think there was definitely things stopped that we didn't start up soon enough.
And you've spoken there, I suppose, about the sort of integrated nature of a lot of these activities. Were there any issues in terms of supply chains in relation to that?
Yeah, many issues, because our members are involved in all aspects of supply chain, and I think if you look at different parts of it, so there was issues in terms of accessing things such as fertiliser and seed at the start of the supply chain for those food producers. And at the same time, there was a stop on the collection of deer carcasses and some issues to do with abattoirs in the very start of the pandemic at the other end. But we also have members who obviously had their contracts for restaurants and other suppliers that came to a halt overnight. So you had members who were suddenly having to sort of pivot their business model to find new customers because they had a glut of supply. And you also had members who were at certain stages of production who suddenly had to think about how they were either going to have to change their product, change their business model at very, very short notice. Excuse me. And I think one of the issues that our members faced at certain times during the COVID period was frustration at what was perceived as the kind of turning off and on with very little notice, because for food supply, food producers, food supply, you can't just turn things on overnight. And sometimes people were asked to sort of restart businesses or stop businesses when with a sort of 12 hours notice, which meant cancellation of orders, which meant that the food producers' stock was returned, or opening at 12 hours notice, which left some of our members scrabbling around for produce. So I think that lack of understanding as to how the whole food supply chain works was a major frustration at times.
Thank you. And you've, just to pick up a couple of things that you mentioned there, you were talking about abattoirs. What was the issue with abattoirs?
Again, I think it was a lack of clarity at the very outset. So until the Act, the Coronavirus Act, which made it quite clear what constituted the supply chain, some of the smaller abattoir providers were unsure as to whether they could still operate. I think some of the larger ones had confidence that they could, but that meant that some of the members that we have in remote areas weren't able to get their or weren't able to have their products butchered. And you also, of course, had people who were waiting to take their things their things to farmers' markets. Linked to that, they often use sort of smaller abattoirs for those. So you had suddenly people not knowing how they were able to butcher livestock. It meant that you then may be keeping livestock for longer. What would that mean in terms of animal health and welfare? What did it mean in terms of business costs, feed costs? So you had all of those kind of backing up at the same time. As I say, you had deer which had already been culled, which were in deer larders, and suddenly members were being advised that the deer carcasses couldn't be collected by the game dealers. So you did have a number of members who had real concerns either about the food that they had sitting in the deer ladders or an animal welfare point of view, because they couldn't follow through in terms of where it should be in the food supply chain.
And again, implicit from what you said, but that's to do with that integration in terms of the chain. If one link goes, the whole chain collapses.
Absolutely, it's that holistic approach, and I think even as an industry, I think there were times when, because we'd had an effective food supply chain for so long, I think it probably made us realise just the fragility at times, certainly of the rural and remote rural areas, where you also are relying on transport. So you're also relying on the ferries running and all of these things coming together to get your product to market. One element of that, such as the removal of a local abattoir, suddenly the whole thing falls apart.
Thank you. You were saying there that perhaps that hadn't been appreciated beforehand. Were there any innovations over the pandemic that might address some of those issues?
I think certainly some of the estates started working as hubs. So some of the larger estates did have facilities in relation to deer larders. So what they were started doing was working with other smaller producers. We've also seen, again, I think some producers realising that they were quite divorced from their market. So when the dealers weren't buying sheep, or they had kind of lost their route to market from I would say, you know, a kind of sort of faceless selling of your livestock. Suddenly they were looking at homegrown markets, local markets. How do they add value to their own product? And some of those haven't gone back to that. They've now changed how they're selling. Whether that was the veggie boxes that we all saw, or some of that local meat supply chain. We did see, I think, a recognition by producers that there was a different way in which they could access a market, which actually might be a better route than selling to supermarkets, or, as I say, to the dealers, you know, who buy in bulk at the auction marts.
Thank you. You spoke before about abattoirs and some of the issues there. Were there any innovations in abattoirs to try and address some of those matters?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, apart from there was some discussion about some mobile abattoirs, but that had always been that was existed sort of pre-pandemic, but it certainly, I think, accelerated during lockdown.
Thank you. And when you were speaking a moment ago about some of the doubt about operations in that food supply chain, where was that doubt arising from? Was it from doubts about guidance, or doubts about key workers, or was there a particular thing that was causing that issue at the start?
I think it was a cumulative impact. I wouldn't say it was one thing. I think it was because there was lack of clarity in each of the elements, which meant that lack of clarity was then amplified because of the collective aspect. And I do think, even in some of the examples about, as we kind of went through social distancing, understanding what could then happen in situations where, for health and safety reasons, you have to operate in a situation where you can't social distance. That was actually really difficult to explain sometimes to those people who were developing guidance from a kind of workplace guidance point of view.
Could you give an example of that?
So if you are handling animals on a farm, there may be times that, from a health and safety point of view, you can't have someone, a vet with an animal, and the person who's supposed to be assisting them making sure that they are 2 meters away from the vet, because from the vet's health and safety and the animal's health and safety, that isn't always possible. So we were assuming that would be understood in guidance, and that would be part of the sort of necessary exemptions. It felt that we then had to start giving examples of every instance that this might be the case, so that could be considered, and that I would say that also existed in in other, I'm trying to think some of the other areas where that existed. When it came to some of the forestry elements, there's definitely times where developing guidance on forestry that it felt that you were trying to sort of take a kind of a mass, a sort of a mass guidance that would be applicable in most situations. And then you looked at forestry and thought that just doesn't work there again, thinking about health and safety, things that have to happen, whatever that thing might be, and almost rewrite the guidance for the exceptions. And it was frustrating at times that we weren't involved at the start, rather than having to retrospectively work through the guidance and think, right, okay, what is it we need to change for forestry, for farming, for wildlife management? And I think that was probably a key frustration of us as an organisation, that we'd be involved in discussions with Scottish Government on an afternoon, talking about the problems that were being faced whether those were in relation to animal health and welfare or others. And the next day, new guidance that we'd never seen before came out. We'd have to interpret it, and then we'd also have to think where are the gaps for our members' businesses, and how do we then ask if these are indeed exemptions, or how do we then have sectoral specific? And I completely appreciate that government couldn't produce guidance for every single scenario, but it would have been far more useful if they'd considered the scenarios at the outset rather than us trying to apply them retrospectively.
When you're looking at these examples, you've obviously given the examples of the veterinarian and the food supply and indeed sporting activities and forestry. You've talked there about some instances where it's impossible not to be in close proximity, and earlier you talked about situations where naturally you wouldn't be in close proximity in terms of some of the sporting work or the like. Are you able to make a comment, taking these kinds of things into account, in terms of the, I suppose, rationality of some of the guidance that was being applied? Did you feel it was too stringent or too lax, or?
I think one of the questions I often asked was the causal effect or the correlation effect. So looking at trying to understand what was the issue or what was the problem they were trying to address. Were they seeing a rise in instances of COVID being spread in certain situations or certain areas? And I know that we were all finding our way through this, but it did seem clear to lots of people fairly early on that maybe activities which were happening outside, and indeed we started to see government being Scottish Government certainly being more relaxed about outdoor activity, but then not really understanding that quite a lot of the business and workplace restrictions they were still continuing to apply also happened outside. So I think that was definitely a frustration, that the lack of understanding of this outdoor activity, which was for leisure and recreation, was in reality the business environment within which our members were operating, and yet they were still subject to restrictions. So I think that was definitely one of the areas that we had issues. And I think one of the other instances was in relation to travelling together. So sometimes it's hard to remember all the restrictions that we had at the time, but when we were restricted from travelling with other people, and at the same time we had people who work in quite remote areas who we cannot allow be lone workers for those very purposes. So again, trying to understand how to ensure Scottish Government was understanding that what they were suggesting, the potential harm seemed to be far greater than the potential risk of COVID, and I think that was a really difficult conversation to be having at times with government, where the only prism or the only lens which was being applied was the COVID lens, and I appreciate why that was from a public health point of view, but at the same time you could be causing harm on a health basis to other people who were then being asked to get in a 4x4 and go to a remote area on their own rather than having somebody with them.
Just picking up that last point, one of the things which his lordship will be looking at is obviously government policy at the end of the day. One of the approaches which the government took was referred to as the four harms approach. Are you familiar with that phrase?
Yes.
And that, as I understand it, please forgive me if I misquote, but essentially is the balancing exercise between direct health, indirect health matters in relation to COVID and general health matters, the economy, and then wider social matters. From your perspective, and given the matters that you've just been discussing, do you feel that balance was correct from a rural perspective?
It certainly didn't feel like it at the time that in terms of the four harms, the harm to business was the one which was given the least importance. And certainly when I think back to the representations that we were making at the time, we had a number of times where we could see that disproportionate impact on businesses which we thought could have operated fairly safely. Just didn't happen because the other harms were given greater priority by Scottish Government. And I think back to, we certainly didn't feel that we had as equal weight in terms of consideration by Scottish Government.
Thank you. You've spoken about a number of employee-related issues. Were there any other employment issues at that time in rural locations?
So for many of our members, the employees will also be residents. So they live on the estate or they live on the business. So again, I think that was a concept that was sometimes hard to grasp for Scottish Government. And it also meant that as employers and landlords, there was things that needed to be done in houses. So again, some of those issues around that I'm sure you may hear from other witnesses about accessing properties to carry out urgent repairs. The reason I sort of say as an employer it was an issue is because the last thing you want to do is upset your employees. So there was sometimes conflict caused because of the inability for the members to carry out things that would normally be done or needed to be done for those who provided with tied accommodation. I think that was definitely one. And I think the other one was in relation to travel. I know that might not sound like an employer issue, but we have members who, certainly in the south of Scotland, who had land holdings, business interests cross border, and I think for many of the rural workers, that actually caused quite a lot of anxiety. So quite a lot of the members in the south of Scotland were looking to us to provide advice or even letters of comfort that it was okay for people to carry out their normal business activity, going across the border to the market or going across the border to look after animal welfare. So I think there was our members took their employees' mental health very seriously, as they always do, and there was definitely times where I would say the impact of guidance and approach in rural areas impacted negatively on employees' mental health, and the employers and Scottish Land and Estates had to step in to support that.
Thank you. When you refer there to borders, do you mean the national border, or which borders are you referring to?
So that for that one it was the national border. I think there was less anxiety travelling between local authority borders when those opened up. But certainly when we had the period where it felt like we had a hard border for Dumfries and Galloway and Scottish borders, that caused a lot of anxiety amongst our members and their employees.
Thank you. We obviously all remember the different levels that were being applied in different local authority areas at different times. And you could find neighbouring areas in different levels. Just to be clear, were there any concerns arising out of that for your members?
There were, and we had members, as I say, who were operating in the Scottish borders who felt that they maybe had customers, or they had potential visitors from Northumberland who couldn't travel there, so they couldn't travel two ways, where you had a very, very low incidence of COVID, and yet people from Edinburgh and Glasgow could come to the Scottish borders because of the way the inter-Scotland travel was. So again, we were asking questions as to why was this allowed, and what impact would this have on businesses. So that was definitely a consideration for members. And we had members in other areas, I have to say, in some of the more remote areas, who probably had anxiety about the travellers from the Central Belt. So they probably had a slightly different approach, that they probably weren't wanting anyone to be travelling to their areas, because they felt that the risk to them was fairly great. And with that, of course, came visitor management issues, the fly tipping, the antisocial behaviour. So I think that the travel between local authority restrictions was viewed quite differently in different areas by different businesses.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about some of the food supply chain uncertainties and uncertainties, and you mentioned that I suppose different businesses in different parts of the country were taking different attitudes. Were there any geographical issues in that regard? In particular, I suppose we've heard other evidence this week about differences of interpretation of key worker, for example. Were any of your members affected by that?
Yeah, so the definition of key worker, as I said, in relation to some of the deer management aspects, that was something that each local authority seemed to take a different aspect. We also found that there was different approaches taken in numerous ways, whether that was in terms of the funding that was being offered, or indeed in terms of some of the kind of the local messaging that was taken on board by local authorities. And it was a real challenge for us as an organisation. We have members who operate, or they have land holdings in more than one local authority. So they were asking if their interpretation was correct, that what they could do in Aberdeenshire differed slightly from what they could do in Moray during the time when each local authority had different approaches, and also asking, is it also right that the funding we're getting is different? So there were times when we were having to pull together information sheets to try and give a Scotland-wide view to members, because if not, they had to go away and find out for every single local authority. Each of the enterprise agencies all had a slightly different approach, and it was very, very difficult for businesses at times to ascertain exactly which local authority was applying which funding approach and which guidance. So I think the local authority specific approach caused a great deal of uncertainty for businesses.
Thank you. And just sticking with key workers for a moment, you've mentioned previously that work on estates and in rural is seasonal. Were there any seasonal issues affecting key workers or workers in general?
I think one of the biggest ones was in relation to the soft fruit harvests. So obviously the time that it came for the berries to be picked and for that harvest to happen, we usually have a significant influx of overseas labour, as well as labour from other parts of the UK. That labour just wasn't available to the sector at all. There were some derogations in terms of some local activity that could happen, which was very, very welcome. So the Scottish Government did put in place a scheme, and forgive me, I can't remember exactly what the scheme was called, but it did allow even people who were furloughed to take on some seasonal activity. So it meant that they were able to pick up some local labour, but it was a fraction of what would normally be required. And I am aware of a number of local food producers local to me in the borders who just sort of said to people, come and pick your own blueberries because we can't harvest them. So we did, I would say that was one of the biggest things that we saw. The most visible thing that we saw was when it came to the soft fruit harvest.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you very briefly about the guidance that was being provided by Scottish Government at the time. You've picked this up on a number of occasions in relation to specific areas and industries. Have you got any comment in terms of the availability of guidance generally?
I think it was inconsistent and patchy. I think that's one of the hardest things to look back on, and at times it felt like there was a new piece of guidance every single day, and at other times it felt as though we were waiting ages for the next one to come out. So I think as a business supporting organisation, we had to be quite proactive in seeking out guidance and pushing the Scottish Government at times to close the gaps. And then at other times it felt like you were sort of saying, please stop issuing guidance, because it was guidance that was changing so quickly that business wasn't able to keep up with the rate of change. So that was quite frustrating. And I remember sort of developing some guidance along with Mr. Ewing and Mr. Swinney at the time, because again there was gaps from the Scottish Government, and despite the government acknowledging that the gap was there and that guidance probably should be produced, there didn't seem to be either a capacity within the Scottish Government or expertise. So I'm grateful that certain politicians then sort of reached out to the sector and said, help us with this, draft that yourselves. Think back to specifics of some of the guidance that came out. Again, at times it seemed to be written by people who'd never actually operated within a business environment. I think that's fair to say, that if they had stress tested or shared a draft with someone with business expertise or with a group of business people, you could have produced guidance that didn't have to then be changed the day after, because the business community had pointed out all the errors within it. So I think that was something that happened far too frequently, that something was published, we and others sort of said, this doesn't work, or you've got all these issues, and we had to produce revised guidance. If they'd spoken to us in terms of the production, we could have had much more workable guidance, more efficient guidance.
Thank you. You've probably mentioned a few things already, Mrs. Laing, but is there anything that you would like to feed back, or you'd like His Lordship to take into account in terms of improvements that could be made in that process?
It's involvement of the experts. I think that's one of the main pieces of advice that I think perhaps it's wrongly, but I felt with some of the civil servants developing the guidance that there was a feeling that, as they put it, vested interests would develop guidance which would suit us as businesses. The reality is that we would be able to provide expert advice to then allow workable guidance to be developed. So I think it's making sure that we're seen as experts and not people just looking after our own interests. So utilising the expertise that exists in certain sectors at the earliest stage, it would be the main piece of advice.
You may not be able to, and please forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot, but I mean, are there any ready sources of that expertise in Scotland?
In terms of the business expertise?
In terms of guidance or business expertise, I mean, in terms of guidance generally, I'm asking, but I don't know in terms of advice services or the like. Is there anything like that that's available already?
So I suppose the business organisations such as ourselves, NFUS and others who operate in the rural sector, but you also have advisors through SAC Consulting. So that's the consulting service funded by Scottish Government, which works with farmers across Scotland. Scottish Agricultural Consultancy. I was trying to remember myself what SAC stood for. But that's an agency part funded by government, which advises rural businesses. So you have people who are every day working with rural businesses that aren't a lobbying organisation. They're not a membership organisation. There are others who are much more sector specific. But you have ourselves and Confor, and a wide variety of organisations who I would suggest are very open and generous with time and expertise, that you know, happy to share that with government, and routinely asked at other times. So I think I maybe would stress that there are many times, you know, routinely the Scottish Government will speak to us about developing guidance, whether that's statutory guidance or non-statutory guidance, but this didn't happen during the pandemic enough.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you very briefly a few questions regarding financial support. You've obviously given us some examples of that already. Could I ask, did SLE receive any funding from the government during the pandemic?
So we received some funding from East Lothian Council, the one that was available to small businesses.
Thank you. And in terms of the government's direction of funding, is there anything that you'd wish to say in relation to how that was approached? Do you feel they directed their money in the right ways?
I don't, and I think one of the things that we have reflected on is that it didn't feel as though the flow to business was as smooth as it could have been, and it felt as though there was not a lot of focus on the administration of the funding rather than the support to business. I do think that there was inconsistency between local authorities. As I said, some local authorities took different approaches. Some local authorities seemed to be much more proactive, and certain agencies were. So if I can highlight the good work done by South of Scotland's Enterprise, they were proactively encouraging businesses to apply for funding. They were, you know, their messaging was great, their communication. Whereas other local authorities seemed to say, we've got a pot. If you want to come and find out about it, here's a website. So I think even just the encouragement given to businesses was different. Again, I think the government's main issue was they tried to create very tightly ring-fenced pots. So if you were if you didn't fall within that pot, that was really unfortunate. And I think the other point I would make is probably in relation to size. There was lots of capping of access to grants. You know, so if businesses were above a certain rateable value, they couldn't access support, and we could never understand the logic of that, because the harm to that business was significant, and it didn't seem logical that they were then excluded from accessing the same level of support, especially as the impact of losing that larger business could be much greater than a smaller business who was receiving support. So I think that capping of support was something that concerned us.
Were there any observations that you'd like to make about the application processes, or the manner or point of contact that people had for those? Again,
very inconsistent. So we had, one of the hardest things seemed to be able to speak to someone. We seemed to kind of revert back to, for some local authorities, very generic, pop your application and you didn't hear anything until you got a yes or no, whereas others were very helpful, talking you through the application process, but also sometimes identifying at a very early stage that you might not be eligible for this one, but here was another fund. Whereas others, as I say, you put your application and you waited back, you heard no, and that was the end of the story. So the inconsistency for businesses was very frustrating.
You're talking there one fund and another fund. I mean, is it implicit from what you're saying that people were having to apply to different places?
They were, again, because of the diversified nature of my members' businesses. Sometimes the fund would be held centrally. It might be a Visit Scotland fund, but they'd also be applying for local government funding. Sometimes they'd be operating across local authorities, so they'd be applying to different local authorities. So yes, there was a number of my members who were applying to different sources and different agencies.
Is there any comment you'd like to make in terms of the convenience of that or otherwise? I
mean, it was inconvenient at the time, but for those those businesses operating in the areas where you did have a sort of business support focused local authority, you could see why a local authority approach could work, because they were able to look at local considerations, they were able to support and advise in that context. So where it worked well at a local level, it worked very well. But conversely, where you had that, where it worked badly, it really failed the businesses in that area.
Thank you. That's all the specific questions I wanted to raise with you today, Mrs. Laing. Just before we finish up, I'll reiterate that all your relate response and all the other documents will be taken into account. But if there's anything else specifically you wish to raise with Lord Brailsford, I'll give you an opportunity to do that now. Very briefly, if I could say.
I don't think there was... The only thing I would say is, as well as the impact on business, was the cost that businesses in rural areas had to pick up because of the changes in behaviour of the general populace. So because we saw a significant rise in fly tipping, and because we saw a significant increase in visitors to our rural areas, those were not business costs. They were not deemed to be business costs, but businesses then had to pick them up. So the support for businesses for non-business activity, so, you know, repairing footpaths, dealing with litter, dealing with antisocial behaviour. Again, I think that's something that our members were asked to cover from an already very, very stretched business income at the time. And I don't think that was recognised throughout the Scottish Government. But that was the main point that I'd like to make.
Thank you. My Lord, I have no further questions unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, nothing. All I need to say is thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Laing. That was very helpful and instructive.
Thank you, my Lord.
Very good. 3 o'clock.
Thank you, Lord.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dunlop. Now, you have a witness for me.
Yes, I have one witness this afternoon, the last witness for the day, and it's Mr. Gareth. Hateley.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr. Hateley.
Good afternoon, my lord.
And I'm sure Mr. Dunlop has got some questions for you. So when you're ready, Mr. Dunlop.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon, Mr. Hateley. Can you provide us with your full name, please?
Gareth Owen Hateley.
Thank you. And do you have any professional qualifications?
Yes.
What are those?
MA, Vet MB, Cert CHP, MRCVS.
And we might not know what those all are. I wonder, the relevant ones for the purposes of your evidence today, could you tell us what those are?
So I'm a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. That means I'm a practicing vet. I have a first degree in veterinary medicine, and I also have a certificate in cattle health and production because that's my area of expertise.
And have you, in terms of being a vet, how long have you practiced as a vet?
I'm now retired. I've practiced for 36 years.
And did you have a particular specialism?
Yes, so it's a career of two halves. The first half was in mixed veterinary practice in Oxfordshire, specialising in cattle, mainly dairy. Then a second career as a veterinary pathologist, and latterly more involvement in disease surveillance. So I was responsible for a government organisation that monitored cattle health and production and diseases relating to cattle across the UK.
Thank you. And I think presently you're involved with the British Veterinary Association. Can you explain what that is and what position you hold?
Yes, so I'm the current president of the Scottish branch of the British Veterinary Association, and the BVA, as it's known, is a member organisation. It's the biggest in the UK. UK-wide, it represents the interests of over 19,000 vets, and in Scotland that would equate to around just shy of 3,000 vets. And its role is to represent their interests, it's to lobby on their behalf, it's to represent the interests of the whole veterinary sector, so that's small animal, large animal, government vets, wherever vets might be employed.
And you said your current position was as Scottish president, is that?
Yes.
How long have you held that position?
I'm in my second year now, and I'll have been serving for 3 years in all, including a period as the junior vice president.
So during I'm trying to work back the way, but during the period, say March 2020 to the end of December 2022, when did you take up your position?
So I took up my position in 2022. Prior to that, I was on the BVA Scottish Branch Council, and I'd been on that for about 4 years.
And in terms of the association, is membership of it mandatory or is it a voluntary?
No, it's a member organisation. Unlike the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, which is the regulatory body which you have to be a member of, it's a voluntary membership.
Do you have any, just because we're asking you questions about what opinions you have in relation to how the pandemic affected vets, do you know what proportion of vets within the UK or in Scotland are members of the association?
So in the UK, it would be just over half are BVA members out of registered veterinary surgeons. In Scotland, it's significantly over half.
Okay. I'd like to ask you some questions now just about veterinary practice in general. Are there principal types of veterinary practices?
Yes, so the first point to make is that veterinary practices are private. There's, to put it colloquially, there's no NHS for animals. Of those private practices, there's a range of structures. They range from small single-handed operations with an owner who will run the business, right up through partnerships, legal partnerships, limited liability companies is another option, and then through to organisations which are colloquially known as corporates. So these will be owned by a group of individuals, some of whom will be vets, but not all. And there will be private equity which will fund the acquisition of groups of practices. and they expand into areas that are beyond just private practice. So we'd be talking about secondary referral practice, emergency services, even laboratories and things like that. So they tend to own a portfolio of businesses which are related.
And we talked about the business structures. You were telling us there was sole traders, essentially partnerships, the corporates and so forth. Is there, and there may not be an answer to this question, is there a typical veterinary practice structure?
The traditional route when I was in practice, for example, would be a partnership, where you'd have a number of partners bought into the business. They would then employ other assistant veterinary surgeons who would work with the business, and also allied professionals like veterinary nurses and receptionist staff and so on.
In terms of the type of work that veterinary, when I talk about veterinary surgeons, can I say vets? That's
yes,
yeah.
Please do.
The type of work that vets undertake now. Obviously, we can imagine that a veterinary practice, which is in the city centre of London, may largely be dealing with smaller animals, and equally a veterinary practice, which is perhaps in Thurso, may be dealing with larger. Are there particular types of specialisms that veterinary practices, are there any particular specialisms that they focus on?
Yes, so again, historically, what most people would regard as the veterinary practice would look something like the James Herriot practice, which would be a mixed practice. These days, there's much more specialisation, and the broadest one would be into what we would call companion animal, and that would cover small animals such as cats, dogs, and small rodents like hamsters. That would also include horses, pet horses. Then you start getting into more specialisms, into equine-only practice, cat-only practice, and in my particular case, you'd have farm practice, and that would cover most of the main farm species. So that would be anything from goats, sheep, and cattle.
You've talked about
also aquaculture. That's another.
Sorry.
Aquaculture, which is particularly
I was
relevant
going to ask,
to Scotland.
Do vets, are they involved in the fish farming industry?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
In what respect? Identifying diseases, or?
Yes. It's providing prescriptions. It's identifying diseases. It's monitoring health status of fish right the way from hatchery through to at sea.
I'm going to be asking, I'm not coming on to this chapter yet, but I'm going to be asking you questions about how it affected veterinary practices, and there might be that your answer's tailored, whether or not it's a companion practice, a companion animal practice, or whether it's a farm animal practice. And I'll try and point that out, but it may be helpful if you identify, because I suspect there were different impacts that affected different practices differently. When we hear the words food security, what does that mean for a vet?
So, for an individual vet, it would relate to the and the sector I'd be talking here would be what we would call the farm animal sector. So it would relate to those farms that individual practice looked after. And in terms of those, it's how each farm performs, what its biosecurity looks like, where diseases come in and out, what animals move. Bear in mind that vets that are dealing with farm animals are, although they deal with individuals, are largely dealing with populations. So it's very much what we would call population medicine. And one of the training areas for vets is public health. And so part of the role that a vet will take on is work on behalf of government. The most prevalent example would be bovine tuberculosis, where the vets will undertake testing on behalf of the government on their clients' farms. And they will do the testing and the disclosure of disease. And in informing the vet of the next steps, so that they're the first line in terms of public health as well.
In those circumstances, presumably the government asked the vets to carry out the bovine test. Are there any proactive food security measures that are initiated either by the farmer?
Yes, and probably the best example is in the pig sector, where disease security is really important. A lot of the pig industry is what we call pyramidal. So there's that it would come under the ownership of one company, and that would involve anything right from the start of the the farrowing process right the way through to finishing, involving multiple farms. And because of the scale of the process and the fact that animals are housed generally through their production period, there's the risk of disease, and so that's paramount in a vet's mind, is containing that pyramid and monitoring diseases through that herd and through the multiple herds.
I want to move on now to ask you I'll ask you some questions about food security and how that was impacted during the pandemic. But before I move on to that, I want to ask you about the essentially guidance that came out at the beginning of the pandemic and what role your association had in relation to that. Yeah. I mean, during particularly the early stages of the pandemic, was the association involved in discussions either with the Scottish Government or the UK Government about guidance which would affect vets?
Yes, very much so. So the BVA is, just to explain, it's a UK-wide organisation. There's a central organisation based in London, and within that there's a family of different veterinary organisations. So in my case it's the British Cattle Veterinary Association. So there's a species specific. There are areas that deal with government vets, and as well as the territorial divisions that I've described. And so there's a liaison between central BVA, if I can call it that, and Scottish BVA, where there are things pertaining to relations with Scottish Government. So relations happened at the two levels. They were initially the guidance given was not specific for vets or vet practices, and so there was and certainly from the Scottish perspective there was a very good an open, pragmatic relationship with Scottish Government, and the one individual that I can name who was very helpful.
Well, if you wouldn't perhaps name any individuals, but you can perhaps tell me the post that they held.
Is the Chief Veterinary Officer.
Chief Veterinary Officer. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you there.
No. I was aware of that, and certainly that continued throughout the outbreak, and was really positive.
Can I maybe just check? You're you're the Scottish president of the BVA. Do you know if I don't know if it's called the English president, but is your opposite number essentially south of the border, is he or she giving evidence to the UKI, do you know?
I believe a submission has been made, but I don't think they've been called to give evidence.
And in your involvement as a Scot, we were talking about the guidance there, and you were saying there was a good open relationship with the Chief Veterinary Officer. Was that... You said that you took up your current post in 2022. Was I suppose the chain of communication, was it between the person that previously held your post?
It was my predecessor who had that role, yes.
And what types of discussions? You said there was good discussions. What type of discussion? And how regularly were they taking place?
I think they occurred on a varying basis, but mostly sort of on a depending on what might how the advice might change, and it would change quite rapidly. So it was probably, I would say, the best way would be to say it's a responsive, and it would be by email mainly. Also, I mean, one of the good things that sort of come out of the COVID is, I mean, my Lord is speaking. I don't know where he is, but he's not here. But similarly, it facilitated those longer distance meetings, and that was very much the case that happened throughout this period.
What prompted the discussion? So you've said that the guidance wasn't specific to veterinary surgeons. So what prompted the discussions between your predecessor and laterally you and the Chief Veterinary Officer?
Yeah, so it would be if if there was an issue, for example, if we had concerns about emergency cover or provision of service at farm level, when it was difficult to come within 6 feet of someone. It was how could you facilitate examining farm animals in that sort of situation. So that's the sort of pragmatism. It was trying to understand how you could minimise the risk by the use of PPE, things like that.
And the impression I got when you talked about the good relationship was that there were the Scottish Government was certainly listening to you. Were they acting upon your members' concerns?
I think as far as they could, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And turning now to, that's the engagement with the association and the Scottish Government. Turning now to the engagement between the association and its members, was there anything, did the pandemic change that dynamic?
Yes. The association's always produced a newsletter on a regular basis for its members, but it changed the way and the speed at which that was done. So, for example, we developed FAQs, frequently asked questions, and those evolved as the pandemic rolled out and as the advice given changed. So we would adapt that to reflect the current situation.
I mean, dealing with the guidance itself, was there feedback from your members as to the adequacy of the guidance that was being issued either at a Scottish Government or a UK Government level?
That I don't know that sort of level of detail, I'm afraid.
And if I asked you, in terms of the clarity of the guidance, would you probably struggle to answer that? And I'm not pressing you for an answer if that's something you don't know. But the clarity of the guidance, was that?
No, I think that the guidance was clear, and it was as specific as we could make it, given based on the advice we had from Scottish Government at the time.
When the Scottish Government issued guidance, did the association produce their own guidance to members in response to that?
Yes, that's the way it worked,
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And how did that work in practice?
You mean how was it
Well,
done?
I suppose what I have in mind is the guidance was changing quite swiftly. How did the association ensure that the guidance was communicated down to the members before there was changes to it again?
Yeah. So as far as I can recall, the guidance was done in a timely way. That's the first thing. It was done electronically. And again, that's another area that developed quite rapidly. Was electronic dissemination of information, and it became. We would. When I say timely, we would release information. If it was quite often, we would hear of information. It might be embargoed for a period until a certain criterion changed and became active, and we would not release information until that embargo had been lifted, and that that's a fairly standard procedure anyway.
And when that guidance was issued, were members coming back saying we don't understand, or were they? Do you know if they were broadly understanding what was required of them?
I think broadly, and I think there was dialogue with members if they had particular queries, we would respond to those. Yes.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask. That prior to the pandemic, if a member had a question about what they should be doing in practice, is the association, would that be a port of call for them?
Yes, it would be. It might not be the association's ambit to provide an answer, but we would be able to point them in a particular direction.
Do you know if those inquiries spiked as a result of the pandemic?
I don't know that.
Okay. In terms of, and I think you mentioned PPE earlier, in terms of PPE, do you know if the association's members were able to secure suitable and sufficient PPE for them to carry out their day-to-day veterinary practices?
I think There were certainly, as I recall, there were some issues in availability. Again, remember that these are private businesses. There was a lot of pressure on, collectively on various medical businesses, and certainly, there were issues with supply of PPE, particularly in the early days of the outbreak, until it started getting geared up a bit better. So in terms of individual vet practices, I'm sure they did experience shortages at the wholesalers.
In terms of veterinary practices, I mean, you talked about the companion animal practices and we talked about the more farm-orientated practices. What PPE, and it may be different for both those different types of practices, what kind of PPE would a vet be required or expected to wear during the pandemic?
So they would often wear a face shield. There would be masks worn in addition. They may well, particularly if closer, associations between individuals was required, they might wear disposable, and this is again something that would be on the large animal side particularly, but they wear disposable overalls. There are different levels of masks. They might have one of the more masks that have higher virological activity in prevention of spread. Gloves, things like that.
Was that because they were coming into contact with other humans rather than the animals?
As much. Yeah.
During the pandemic, was there any collaboration between veterinary practices?
Yes. So, and again, particularly in Scotland, and I think this is one area where BVA was able to help. We promoted the concept of collaboration between practices in order, because a lot of farm work in Scotland is well, obviously it's rural, but it can be very remote, and servicing the needs of the farm community could be difficult, particularly as some vets had key worker status, others like small animal vets didn't, and there was there could be occasions where vets might not be, they might be ill, they might have COVID themselves, they might have to isolate, and we promoted the idea of collaboration between practices to help cover each other's clients if there was an emergency, and one of the things we sign when we become a veterinary surgeon, it's not quite a Hippocratic oath, but our constant endeavour is the health and welfare of the animals under our care, and we have a duty of to provide 24/7 emergency, including support, including pain relief, and that's part of the RCVS, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons Code of Conduct. And that applies to all vets. There are no exceptions, and so we wanted to promote that, the concept of collaborative working to support that that requirement.
And if that worked well, is that something that's carried on post-pandemic?
I think it's probably helped, but I think that the structure of veterinary practices has changed since the pandemic, and that's sort of market driven. So market forces have probably taken over from that. I think certainly in the short term there was a lot, there's a lot of collaboration, and in Scotland there's always been quite a lot of collaboration between practices anyway. Because of the nature of the work.
I'll come on to what impact and what residual impact, but since you mentioned market forces have changed the structure of practices, could you just tell us what you mean by that and whether it's related to the pandemic?
Yeah, so this probably isn't related to the pandemic, but certainly in the last few years in Scotland, there's been an increase in the proportion of practices that are corporately owned, definitely, and that has very much changed the the structure and the way practices are set up and the way vets work with each other.
Just dealing with corporate practices existed at the time of the pandemic.
And prior, yes.
And prior. Did they, in the association's view or in your view, did they fare better than the more traditional practices you refer to? And if so, why?
I think all, and I'm speaking particularly to the small animal sector here, there was a significant drop in income as a direct result of the pandemic, in that routine work in that sector had to slow down and stop, and I would suggest that the impact on the corporates was probably less because of the size of the operation. They probably got a bigger cushion. Smaller businesses would have been impacted much more. And that's just a factor of business. I don't think it's more. I'm not meaning it
rather than a veterinary issue.
Yeah.
In terms of, we know that a lot of businesses closed during the pandemic, particularly in the kind of the leisure and bar trade and so forth. Veterinary practices, did they close or reduce their services?
They were given exemption under the regulations to remain functioning, but because of the nature of the restrictions, that meant that the type of work that could be done changed dramatically. So to minimise contact with between people, the number of consults that you could do in a particular time had to change. How you manage those consults had to change. So a lot was done in the open air. I know, for example, that a lot of car parks got filled with porta cabins to try and increase the space available, and certainly some of the vet schools installed porta cabins to help spread the people out and enable services to continue. So yes, I think the main impact was inability to do the close work for at the same rate, and that, of course, of itself led to significant issues with servicing of rotas, providing cover, and that had an impact on the work rate of vets, and that led to well-being issues. That certainly did. We certainly did have an increase in issues with stress for vets.
Can I just pick up on a few points that you mentioned there? You said it impacted on the type of work done, and you talked about, I think you said close work.
Yeah.
When you say close work, is that individuals, humans, in close contact?
Yes, and a minimising of routine work that would not necessarily need to be done. So a deprioritisation of things like vaccinations, routine worming, that sort of thing. So prioritisation was put on animals that were ill and needed veterinary care for that.
And was there, do you know if the association was able to tell, was there any reluctance of people to go to vets during the pandemic?
It certainly changed the way vets related to their clients. So it did mean that rather than the individual owner being, one of the more difficult aspects of it would be that owners could not be present when their animals were euthanized.
Right.
So that, yes, it did have an impact.
And that presumably had an impact on the individuals, because presumably the individuals, those individuals that want to be there, presumably for the animals' last moments.
Absolutely, and also bear in mind that would also have an impact on the vets too, and the vet staff.
In what respect?
Because they are caring people, and they can see the stress that it would put the owners under, and also the animal.
Okay. And you mentioned well-being issues. Can you develop that slightly? Can you tell me what well-being issues affected vets during the pandemic?
So I think, well, the example I've just given you was one. You know, this is a peculiarly caring profession, and it takes its responsibilities incredibly seriously, and there was a lot of moral distress when vets couldn't do what they would normally do, the way they would normally do it, and you know, euthanasia is probably the most, I was going to say extreme, but perhaps that's not it's at the sharpest end of things, perhaps, but being unable to relate to one's clients in the same way also has an impact on the veterinary surgeon, and just the workload. For example, some of the surveys that the BVA produced, that it does this Voice of the Veterinary Profession survey, and the Voice survey in 2022 noticed an increase in concerns about well-being going up from 83 to 94%. So there was definitely an uplift in concerns reported by members. And that's at UK level, I should explain.
And when you say well-being going up, so can you
concern about.
Oh, concern about.
Yeah.
In terms of, you mentioned earlier that smaller practices experienced a reduction in financial turnover. Generally, the veterinary profession, did it generally, including the partnerships, perhaps excluding the corporates, but did they generally experience a reduction in turnover?
Definitely, yes. Yeah.
And were there financial grants or funds available to veterinary practice?
Yes. So certainly in Scotland, the small business bonus scheme, which I think was a £10,000 one-off payment, was available. Initially, business rate relief, small business rate relief was not available, and that was one thing that the BVA did argue at both UK and Scottish level, and we did get business rate relief for small practices. There's a service industry grant, which again vets could avail themselves of. I've mentioned the exemption from closure, which obviously has an impact here. There's also there was a self-employed income support scheme which vets could avail themselves of, and bearing in mind that from our figures from the survey I've just mentioned, around 40% of vets are either partners or self, part of owning a business or are self-employed. So a significant tranche of the profession could avail themselves of this support, which was very welcome.
And in terms of the available to support, did that prevent veterinary practices that otherwise may have? Did it prevent, I suppose, did it save veterinary practices that otherwise may have gone under, for want of a better term?
I think so, and particularly the smaller ones. There was also the furlough scheme, which practitioners could use, and I can give an anecdotal example of a practice with 2 vets, 2 nurses and receptionists. They furloughed one of the vets and the receptionist, and kept going with 1 nurse and 1 receptionist, and this was a small island practice. They were able to do the emergency stuff, but one of the things they commented on, and I might come back to this a bit, was the key worker status wasn't available to them, although one individual actually worked for the Coast Guard and so got key worker status, and that helped them manage their affairs.
It sounds generally as if you're quite or the association's quite positive about the funding. Is there anything that could have been done differently that would be directed particularly to veterinary practice?
Yeah, I think without putting bigging it up too much, but I think the veterinary profession had a big role, particularly if you bear in mind that during the COVID period, with people at home, they were very, very much reliant on their pets for their own well-being. Well, I own a pandemic puppy. You might put it like that. And for individuals' well-being, that was really, really important. And I think there was a public good role that vets played in that, and so I think it would be fair to say that for reasons like that, I think more support and earlier would have helped perhaps reduce the number of people who were furloughed. There were issues initially around the time that people had to be furloughed, and that impacted on rotas and emergency cover, which is another thing that's peculiar to the profession. This requirement to provide those services, and so having more flexibility in more people in order to be able to facilitate these rotas would have been helpful, particularly earlier on.
Okay, thank you. And your association helpfully have submitted a Rule 8 response, and that's, I suppose, for your Lordship's benefit, that's document BVA 5 zeros and a 1. I wonder if we could, yep, that's up on the screen. Can you see that in front of you,
yep.
Mr. Hateley? And at paragraph 22 of that response, you state that your association continues to lobby the government on the role that, sorry, I'll let you get to that.
Yes, I can see that.
Continues to lobby the government on the role that veterinary surgeons play in public food safety and also control of, is that zoonotic diseases? Is that how it's
zoonotic.
Zoonotic, sorry, diseases. Can you tell me what you mean by that and whether the pandemic had any effect on that?
Yeah, certainly. So, zoonotic diseases are diseases that are passed to man from animals, so they're of animal origin, and that's relevant in the context of the pandemic in which the investigation is focused, because something of the order of 75% of new and emerging diseases are of animal origin. So there's very much a public health and what I would call a One Health involvement, and the vets are key to that. And by One Health, what I mean is the overlap between public health, animal health, and the environment, and combine that with the fact that the majority of these animal-related diseases, not COVID, but the new and emerging diseases, are what we call vector-borne, and by a vector, that's something that will transmit the disease between animals, and the majority of those are arthropods, so that insects, ticks, that sort of thing, and so that has implications for things like climate change, because that'll affect the range that these insects can spread, and also globalization. I can give an example of blue tongue, which isn't zoonotic, so it doesn't affect people. It's a disease that we've got in the UK at the moment. It's spread by midges. The range of those midges, which enables spread from this disease being a tropical disease to a disease that now occurs in Northern Europe. And it's a disease that can pop up almost anywhere in Northern Europe, and that's facilitated by people moving, things moving, including things like flowers, and that facilitates spread of diseases. So within that context, the veterinary profession's role is absolutely central.
And has that been has that, I don't know, have people been listening more as a result of the pandemic, or listening less, or is there anything that the pandemic has altered about this, the lobbying?
Yeah, so I think that the main issue here has been that pre-pandemic and peri-pandemic there was probably a less understanding than there is now, and I'll contextualise that, about the role that vets can play. And I'm talking about sort of national level here. So there's a lot of veterinary expertise in terms of epidemiology, disease control. There's a Centre for Epidemiology and Disease Control, which looks after animal diseases, but it's similar there are similar principles in controlling. There's no special spell to make a disease, a human disease manageable in a different way. There's a lot of expertise within the veterinary profession and wider that could and did support the COVID inquiry. And another example would be laboratory services. I think, anecdotally, I'm aware that some public health people were surprised that veterinary laboratories work to the same quality assured standards as human medical ones do, and to the same ISO accreditation. So, having that awareness earlier on and tapping into that would be a really good thing. And one positive thing is that the government's chief scientific advisor is now a vet.
You still have the Rule 8 response that your association submitted in front of you. At paragraph 29, you discuss a survey that was undertaken. Can you tell me, and if it helps, you can, obviously you have the bullet points there, what was the purpose of the survey and what were the key findings?
So the voice of the veterinary profession survey, that's again, just to contextualise, that's a UK rather than a Scotland specific survey. It's been running for a good decade and probably more. That's probably my memory being faulty. And what it does is every 6 months or so, questions are asked of the profession, from the BVA members, of topical issues, things of particular concern, and the idea is to get a sense of what the profession's views are on particular issues. I mean, I think the phrase is taking the temperature. It's seeing what, where people's thinking are at. So it's an evolving thing. It's not always the same questions each time. It changes according to what the issues are of the day. And certainly there were very much in the peri and slightly post COVID period, these were very much COVID related issues, but though not exclusively.
And we see those bullet points in the response.
Yeah.
Just a few more questions. In terms of, you mentioned key worker status, and I think you stated that some vets attracted key worker status and others didn't. Can you tell me why that was the case?
The main driver for key worker status was involvement in public health. So in my example, because I'm related directly to UK disease surveillance, I was given key worker status. Small animal practitioners and equine as well weren't given that status. So it's the association with food production, with public health that drove that status. Yes.
I'm looking to the future of the profession, the veterinary surgeon profession. Was there anything, well, I suppose anyone that wants to become a vet presumably has to do a degree. There's not any other professional route to... Really.
There might be,
right,
but
okay.
Currently, no.
In terms of when a student completes their degree, is the next stage a period of training?
So, just to explain, most veterinary courses will have a component of clinical work which will either be introduced right at the start of the course or towards the end in a more traditional course. That clinical training is supplemented by what's called extramural studies. It's what when I was a student, what we called seeing practice. And that builds on the experience that the student gets. Practically they'll go and join a local practice and get to know them and be given tasks to do, and they can learn how to stitch. They can learn how to do the various operations, specific procedures. One of the things that we found anecdotally in talking to some of the practices and also some of the schools was, and I should say that this is in no way intended to be critical of the schools at all. They bent over backwards to ensure that students could get as much clinical experience as they could, but by the nature of the beast, their clinical experience was reduced. And that would mean, for example, when a vet qualified, they'd probably have less opportunities to do a particular procedure. They might have not actually physically seen or carried out a particular procedure as often as they might have done. And I know there were concerns that in the early days post-COVID that cohort of new and young vets might have been not less competent, but perhaps less confident in doing some of the procedures. And there is a short period of a couple of years post qualification where there's what we call the vet GDP program that they follow, where they are mentored and supported.
What could have been done differently to prevent that happening?
It's difficult to see how that could be the case. I think more increased. One of the potential changes is the increased use of telemedicine. And the area of veterinary work that springs to mind where that's very much the case is fish. Where a vet can have care of animals that may be hundreds of miles away, but because of the technology, they can have a real-time feed of images direct from a fish net into their office. And that sort of thing has. So one of the things that did change during COVID was a relaxation of the code of conduct, which allowed more use of images and distance, what you might loosely call distance medicine.
You say hundreds of miles, presumably that could extend to thousands of miles. It could open international
absolutely.
trade up.
Yeah.
In terms of impacts which haven't reduced to pre-pandemic levels, are there any particular key ones that spring to mind?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Are there any impacts which haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels which spring to mind?
Certainly income has sprung back. I'm struggling to think of any things that were, anything specific.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I have no further questions. I mean, finally, before I just thank you for your time today. I don't know if there's anything further that you'd wish to say on behalf of the association in relation to impacts on the profession.
So I think I've alluded to. Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity of speaking, and thank you for your collective attention. I would reiterate the importance of vets at the national level, as I've already described. I think that also there are roles that vets can do at the local level, and by virtue of their public health training that they receive, their experience in biosecurity and disease control, I think they would be very useful working at local authority level in supporting outbreak control. So just to say that, don't overlook the profession. It's got a lot of skills.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Hateley. My Lord, there are no further witnesses for this afternoon.
Very good. All that remains for me to do is to thank Mr. Hateley. I'm very much obliged for your assistance and your time, Mr. Hateley. Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you, my Lord.
We'll sit again tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thank you.